A planet in peril, species on the edge of extinction, natural resources dwindling, entire ecosystems threatened, plants, animals and people challenged on many fronts. The clock is ticking. Can humanity find a balance between progress and preservation to create a more sustainable future? CGTN's Global Action Initiative starts now. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu. Welcome to CGTN's Global Action Initiative 2022 on sustainability. All week we have touched on aspects of sustainability, from ways China is pursuing the UN Sustainable Development Goals 2030 to how younger generations are picking up the mantle. We've looked at the role of businesses and seen how China has embraced green technology in sports. We also heard how some NBA athletes are practicing sustainability. In this hour, we'll consider the outcome of the COP15 meeting on biodiversity hosted by China in Montreal, Canada. And we'll examine where we are headed. What does the future hold for the Sustainable Development Goals, for efforts to protect nature and slow the devastating impacts of climate change? We'll hear from top-ranking UN officials, government ministers and global experts. All of that coming up. The World Wildlife Fund works with partners around the world toward the goal of humans living in harmony with nature. Here now, Marco Lambertini, Director General of WWF International.
Today, we are living unprecedented times. Humanity is at an important fork, and particularly at the time of redefining perhaps our most important relationship, the relationship with nature, our mother, our lifeline, our support system. On one hand, unfortunately, regrettably, the figures about our pressure, our impact on the planet are terrifying. We lost half of the forest, half of the coral reefs, 80% of the wetlands, more than two-thirds, 69% of wildlife populations have declined globally on land, in the freshwater systems, or in the ocean. And 1 million species are threatened with extinctions. We are entering the 6th mass extinction planet Earth has experienced in its 4.5 billion years since life appeared on Earth. But on the other hand, the good news is that, first of all, we are aware of these pressures and these impacts, but also, more importantly, we're beginning to understand the consequences that our impact on the planet is having, not just on the natural world, that we have the moral duty to coexist with, but also on our own lives, on our economy, on our social stability, on our health, well-being. And actually, it is also, at the end of the day, a justice issue, particularly an intergenerational justice issue, because by affecting, destabilizing the natural systems, we are creating a very difficult legacy for our children and their children. So this new awareness is the seed for change. And the change that we need to see as fast as possible is about rebalancing our relationship with nature by evolving our production and consumption system in a way that we continue to develop, we continue to generate the prosperity and the human development that we need, and in a more equitable way distributed across the world without destroying, without impacting the natural systems, biodiversity, ocean, forest, river systems, etc. That's with the new understanding that, in fact, we depend on nature more than nature depends on us. And we will be paying the price, ever-growing price, of our unbalanced relationship with nature. We have the opportunity to embrace a global goal and a global plan to halt and reverse nature loss by the end of this decade. WWF and many others are supporting a global goal that hand in hand, a global goal of nature positive and net positive biodiversity by 2030. That means more nature by the end of the decade than at its start. That together with the climate global goal of carbon neutrality, net zero emissions by 2030, represents our double compass to drive our journey towards a sustainable future. Carbon neutral and nature positive are interdependent because nature plays a fundamental role to absorb and store carbon and reduce the impact of our anthropogenic emissions. And that's very clear today. Today, we know that we need to halve our emissions, but on the other hand, we also need to protect the ability of nature to store and to absorb. Imagine that the forests of the world are storing the equivalent of 100 years, a century of emissions at the current level. So the role of nature for climate change, but also for water security, for food security, for human health is critical and is increasingly understood. So nature conservation is not any longer just an ecological or a moral issue alone, but it is also an issue that is about preserving our prosperity, safeguarding our economy, and our well-being in general. So under this new understanding, this new awareness, is now the opportunity to embrace a global plan that allows all governments, all businesses, all investors, and all consumers to contribute towards a nature-positive future. Because in order to have a people-positive future, the only way to that is to also achieve a nature-positive future, a future where people and nature live in harmony. Thank you.
Across the globe, fertile, livable land is being lost to overuse, drought, and desertification. The UN Convention to Combat Desertification works to protect the land that provides humanity with food, water, and energy. Here now, UN CCD Deputy Executive Secretary Andrea Mesa Murillo.
Hello, my name is Andrea Mesa, Deputy Executive Secretary of UNCCD, the United Nations Convention that it is the voice of land, and former Minister of Environment of Costa Rica. Thank you for inviting me here to participate in this global action initiative. For me, sustainability means a new development model where we can produce and consume respecting the planetary boundaries, where we can guarantee inclusion and that all human beings have their basic needs covered. Sustainability means that our societies and economies recognize that land and nature are assets that we need to protect and manage. Because to have healthy economies and societies, we need healthy land and healthy ecosystems. Right now, up to 40% of our land is degraded. And if we don't implement a system change, by 2050, we will destroy more soils, degrading an area of the size of South America. But we can do things in a different manner. Globally, you can find success stories of citizens, communities, cities, companies, and countries that are demonstrating that we can stop and change this suicidal trend. In the Sahel in Africa, with the Great Green Wall, in Asia, with the Middle East Initiative, or in Central America, where a small country called Costa Rica, which had the highest deforestation rate, managed to implement new regulations, incentives, and policies that stop deforestation, increase its forest cover, and triple its GDP. Yes, investing in land restoration is a good deal. For every dollar invested in this agenda, you will have a return of $7 to $20 in economic benefits. Sustainability also means aligning all financial flows and redirecting the perversive subsidies to the goal of being net zero emissions and nature positive by 2050. And to achieve this, we need to protect, manage, and restore nature. Let's be united for land.
Inga Anderson is the Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Programme. The message from the UN: the world must make changes and make them quickly.
We need to roll out more aggressively renewable energy. We need to roll out more aggressively the financing for that renewable energy to those who cannot afford it, because there's still many nations that live in energy poverty, where not 100% of people have access. And it's critical that these countries can serve their people in the same way that other countries can. But they need to do it with renewables. And so we need to have payments, financing, investments going to these countries so that they can get that. We need to have innovation And it's happening. We just need to accelerate it on e-mobility, electric mobility, the way to go, non-emission based. Of course, we need some other elements to create the batteries, etc., for these vehicles, but we can do that. Human beings are incredibly clever and smart. The issue is now that we're not doing it fast enough. And so those shifts that we need to see in the economy, where we decarbonize, where we do not use coal, oil, and gas with the same amount of intensity, where we understand that we need to level off, we have to accelerate that. Right now, with the conditional NDCs, these promissory notes that countries gave, they said we are going to reduce our emissions by X. When we add that up, we come to 2.7 degrees at 2100. And when we then take on board the net zero pledges, others have said we will arrive at net zero, we come to 2.1 degrees. Today, we live at 1.2, 1.3 degrees, and we're already seeing wildfires, floods, inundations, and droughts and catastrophes. So we need to move much faster and with much greater acceleration.
This year, much of Europe faced blistering heat waves and a growing energy crisis. Hungary's Foreign Minister Peter Szijjártó shared his thoughts on sustainability.
It's a critical issue nowadays, putting into consideration the energy crisis which we have to experience in Europe mostly, but I understand globally. This means that the green transition must also be accelerated, but in a pragmatic way. So I mean environmental protection and economic competitiveness must go hand in hand. None of these two should overtake the other, because if the balance is being broken, then the credibility of the whole process is over. So that's why we do believe that nuclear investments should be accelerated, and solar investments should also be accelerated. We should not discriminate negatively the nuclear. Unfortunately, in Europe, there have been some attempts to negatively discriminate the nuclear way of generating energy, and we had to fight a lot for the level playing fields to be ensured. So the pragmatic and normal and common sense based way of the green transition, I'm pretty convinced, is the nuclear investments.
Colombia is home to vast natural resources and has been working to make sustainability a priority. Here now, Sandra Velarde, Colombia's Vice Minister of Environment.
Hola, soy Sandra Velarde, Viceministra de Políticas y Normalización Ambiental del Ministerio de Ambiente de Colombia. Para mí es un placer acompañar el Global Action Initiative de CGTN America. Estamos en una triple crisis, la crisis de la biodiversidad, de la crisis climática y la crisis de la contaminación. Por lo tanto, la sostenibilidad, ese valor que debemos aspirar todos los ciudadanos de este planeta, implica hacerle cara a esa triple crisis, a enfrentarla no solamente con nuestro comportamiento, sino también para impulsar a los gobiernos a que hagan las mejores políticas para enfrentar el deterioro global y sobre todo poder redireccionar la senda de una protección de la naturaleza, de una protección de los procesos funcionales del planeta, para que todos podamos seguir viviendo en un planeta más seguro, más estable y que siga generándonos bienestar a todos los ciudadanos. Necesitamos cerrar el ciclo de materiales, necesitamos cerrar cómo todos los actores podemos hacer un uso mucho más eficiente e inteligente de los procesos económicos que hay a lo largo de la industria, de los servicios, de la economía. Esta política, por ejemplo, de economía circular nos ayuda a todos a ponernos, a darle valor a eso, a poder ver otros productos económicos, otros servicios económicos, otros empleos en pro de la sostenibilidad. Tenemos políticas también que en este momento estamos revisando, como la política de gestión integral de recurso hídrico y la política de humedales. Colombia es un país de aguas, es un país no solamente megadiverso, sino que tenemos el 30% de nuestra superficie continental son humedales, sumadas a una gran red de drenaje de aguas que van desde los Andes hasta las costas, no solamente en el Pacífico colombiano, sino también en el Caribe. Colombia se ha relacionado con China de manera muy especial en estos últimos meses previos a la COP15 de biodiversidad y también a la COP de Ramsar. Hemos felicitado el esfuerzo que ha hecho China para poder convocar a todos los países del planeta en esta agenda tan importante de la biodiversidad y de los ecosistemas. Hemos podido participar en varios espacios en conjunto. Nuestra ministra y el ministro chino de Ambiente han podido trabajar de manera conjunta y colaborando en varios procesos. Obviamente el primero y más importante es poder celebrar y acordar el marco post-2020 de biodiversidad. Pero adicionalmente estamos trabajando de manera también conjunta en un acelerador para que los gobiernos puedan cumplir esos planes de acción de la biodiversidad. Hemos trabajado también en posibilidades de cartas y memorandos de entendimiento sobre los temas de humedales y recursos hídricos y hemos también tenido la posibilidad de colaborar en espacios para formación de jóvenes y de técnicos. Quiero invocar a la gente joven a que piense en su futuro, pero sobre todo a que piense en la maravillosa posibilidad de construir un futuro mucho más sostenible. Todos tenemos una gran responsabilidad en este planeta. Los jóvenes de las regiones tropicales, en donde está la mayor biodiversidad, tienen una posibilidad inmensa de valorar, de conocer, de crear experiencias, de crear otro tipo de valores alrededor de la biodiversidad. Pero también poder aportar con su ingenio, con su creatividad, con las ganas de experimentar otro tipo de posibilidades de soluciones. Los necesitamos. Necesitamos a los jóvenes activos, empoderados, responsables, creando soluciones. Los jóvenes urbanos, pero también los jóvenes de los pueblos indígenas, los pueblos de las zonas rurales, de las zonas costeras, los jóvenes de las comunidades afro, los jóvenes campesinos, los jóvenes de las comunidades pescadoras. A todos los necesitamos, porque esta sociedad que está en un proceso de cambios profundos necesita oxígeno, creatividad, pero sobre todo pasión.
What does the future of sustainability look like? Let's turn to our panel. Yixing Xu joins us from Osaka in Japan. He explores pathways to clean energy and collaborates with universities and industry leaders to solve clean energy challenges. He is research director at Breakthrough Energy, but is not speaking on behalf of that company. Ronnie Hamad is managing partner at the Sublime Institute and a consultant for organizations that include the World Bank. His work includes experience in climate change issues and green economic policies. He joins us right here in Washington, D.C. Karen Wong is a climate tech entrepreneur and founder of Climine, a digital platform that crunches climate change data to make it more accessible and actionable. She's also a research assistant at Imperial College Center for Climate Finance and Investment and the first Chinese woman selected as a young leader for the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Karen Wong, let me start with you. The primary sources of renewable or sustainable energy right now are wind, solar, nuclear, hydropower, among other things. What role will technology and innovation play in the future of sustainability?
Thank you so much. First of all, it's really such an honor to speak out here and share my experience. The role of technology and innovation at a broad level, it definitely accelerated how human beings can tackle on the climate and sustainability issues. We now are empowered by so many different ways and tools. Look at how we tackled with the COVID, like the development of vaccine has definitely at a speed like we have never experienced ever to tackle on the issue. Back to accessibility issues, the technology and innovation, I think in a way it can help us to better understand what's the actual and then to have better measurement of the climate and the sustainability issue itself. With the monitoring system and then with the internet and then different device IoTs we have. On the other hand, I think technology and innovation itself is also accelerating the tools that we're able to build to tackle on the issues. So related to some work we do using the data source to have better measurement of the climate issues starting from the carbon emission at the country level and also company levels. What matters more is before we have the chance to actually build more solutions, we need to do the budgeting and then you do the cost based on different climate scenarios.
Ronnie Hamad, what is the connection between climate change and sustainability? How will the efforts to mitigate the impact of climate change, help us move towards a more sustainable future?
Well, thank you for having me on your show. Look, if you think about the last 10 years before COVID, we saw, after the financial crisis, we saw major turmoil in many countries, structural weaknesses, we call them. We've seen that poverty has been increasing, investment is growing, inequality is growing, and climate, obviously, we've seen more floods and more droughts. And all of that has exposed the idea that we really need to think about the interdependence of the people, the planet, and the economy. You can't just simply think about economic growth without thinking about its impact on people, or have a transition away from fossil fuels without looking at the impact on the economy. So I think there's a new vision in terms of thinking about how to have growth that's more resilient, more inclusive, but also really tackles the opportunities we have, particularly in renewable energy.
And Ronnie, that's where we are finding many of the tensions in many countries, the kind of balance that countries are trying to find between combating climate change on the one hand and not sacrificing economic growth.
Yeah, and I think it's a false paradigm to say that one has to be at the cost of others. When you think about human and economic activities, they all belong to the same ecosystem of services. And these services, if you deplete them, and then it's going to have a negative impact on economic performance. So you do need to look at this. So that's why the Sustainable Development Goals are an opportunity, a mechanism for policymakers to think about economic growth, yes, but look at issues of poverty, look at the issues of inequality, look at how we can do things in a more sustainable way, protect our oceans, protect our air. Because if you don't do that, then there's nothing much to really grow. And, we've seen the consequences in the last few years of what that's like.
Yixing Xu, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, they range from combating climate change to eradicating poverty and hunger to providing education and healthcare. They were agreed upon by member states in 2015. Since then, of course, as we just heard, there have been a number of changes. We've had the pandemic. We've had other challenges as well. I mean, the world could be on the edge of a recession right now. And that has raised questions about retooling these goals that were mentioned in the UN Sustainable Development Program. Here's Amina Mohammed, who is Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations. Let's listen to what she had to say.
The SDGs are ambitious, but they're just what we need. It is still the framing around which the world comes together to hope and to move in a direction that we can achieve them. I think what is beautiful about sustainable development is that today it's 17 goals, in 2030 it may be 8 or it may be 10. What is important is not to fail before you get to 2030. Keep plugging away, making the investments, making your voices heard where leaders are concerned to get the right things done for it. So I'm very hopeful halfway through the SDGs. We could pivot, we could find the opportunities, as I say, the silver lining in the dark cloud of COVID or Ukraine or climate crisis, to move the next 7 years to 2030 with a lot of successes. So no giving up, no. This is not a time to reset. This is a time to put more wind under the wings of the SDGs.
So Yixing Xu, listening to those concerns there, do you believe that these goals need to be revised, or can these targets be met in the time we have?
I fully agree with the point that we should keep those goals. Those goals are very important. Those goals keep people focused and the joint force to invest in innovation, in technology deployment. And also, we fully understand these goals are very aspiring goals. It's extremely difficult, but we remain optimistic, because in the past several years, what I see is that people are working together and more people are joining the force to be innovators, to make better policies, and to do better business in sustainability. These goals are very important to be there, to help people focus on the most important things. And right now, it's not the time to revise the goal, but the time to inspire more people to join us, to help us achieve the goal. And in the past several years, we see that there are more private and public fundings goes into energy and climate and other areas of sustainability goals. And we do see incredible progress in the last few years. So I'm optimistic about the next 10 years. It's time for everyone to work together. That means engineers, scientists, investors, policymakers, business people, we all need to work together to make it happen.
Karen, what is your view on this? How can we speed up the transition to a green economy? I mean, what are the kinds of sort of scientific, technical, and research resources we have at our disposal for that?
I think the funding gap we're facing, especially in developing economies, is critical. And we definitely need public and private sectors collaborations, for example, like multilateral banks to give more support on the capacity building or bringing the innovative instrument to support the projects in developing economies. But apart from the capital funding issue, like the second thing is definitely the growth of technology to accelerate how we can adapt and also to mitigate the issues. But in the end, I think it's something we usually ignore is about the appreciation about nature. For example, like ocean is like the biggest carbon sink we have on the planet. So how we can make the best use of the nature and then find a way to compensate it is also coming up. And an important power, I think the developed economy and the developing can work together. So I just came back from COP27 in Egypt. And there's also interesting things happening at COP this year. For example, addressing on the loss and damage funding as a breakthrough, which hasn't happened for the past couple of decades. But I think to accelerate, definitely one word, if I had to take away, is to collaborate. And then that's critical.
Ronnie Hamad, what are the kinds of tools that national governments have at their disposal to promote more sustainable development? And I'm guessing that those tools, of course, will vary across the globe depending on resources, finance, and things like that. But how do they move towards a green economy?
I think governments have a lot of tools at their disposal. I mean, if you think about the budget, governments can really look at where the money is going, where they're spending, and particularly think about the risks that might be identified with regards to potential extreme weather. If you think about just what happened in Pakistan, for example, very few countries have contingencies of billions of dollars to address climate change. So in the event that they have looked at these contingencies and prepared for that, there are tools and financing instruments that allow them to do that. E-government, for example, is another opportunity. So imagine if you had a lot of government documents, birth certificates, death certificates, all of that in paper documents and not digitized. If governments were able to invest in that, they would be able to do it. Green procurement is a huge thing. If governments spend a lot of money on goods and services, if they were to be able to spend a percentage of that on green, resilient energy efficiencies and government fleets and buildings, that would make a huge difference. State-owned enterprises have a huge role to play. So there's a lot of tools that I think governments have to really implement them. And there is a lot of financing available from international organizations like the World Bank and regional development banks that can really help support them in this area.
Yixing Xu, one of the biggest challenges we face right now is the gap between developing nations and developed nations when it comes to promoting more sustainable development. How do you see that gap being bridged?
Yes, I think that's a very good point. Like right now in developed countries like the United States or Europe, they already have very good policies to support their future green economy. For example, in the United States, the last 12 months is a great thing for the clean energy industry with the Inflation Reduction Act and other several acts. The total funding from the government in the next 10 years is about $500 billion. So that's a huge amount of money to support countries like the United States And similarly, in European countries, they have sufficient funding from government to support their clean energy industry. However, in a lot of developing countries, that's not the case. And in my opinion, these two group of countries, they have different priorities. I think for developed countries, definitely United States or European regions, they need to develop and invent new technologies very fast. And they need to have their government support and also their industry to work really hard to bring down the cost of those new technologies. And for developing countries, I think their priority is about how can they scale up the existing mature clean energy technologies, such as wind, solar, hydro, to quickly scale up these technologies to replace fossil fuel technologies. So I think these two group of countries have different goals and different priorities for now, and these priorities actually fit in their situation. I think it is a developed country's obligation or responsibility to help develop these technologies for the whole world, because if we want to fight climate change, solutions need to be applied everywhere, not just in certain regions, definitely not just in rich countries, but it has to be applied to all countries.
Right, Ronnie Hamad, what are your thoughts on bridging this gap between developed and developing nations? I mean, you mentioned the World Bank a moment ago. How can international institutions like the World Bank help with this, not just in terms of finance, but I presume there's also a challenge to change mindsets as well?
Well, mindsets is a really big point, and I think the word I would want to use is what Jixing mentioned and Karen also mentioned, is collaboration. I mean, this is not a problem that can be solved by any one country. And that's why, so the funding that, as what COP27, the scale-up fund that was available for developing countries to be able to do this is really critical. I think the technology, there's a lot of interesting technologies that are going to be happening, particularly with regards to smart grids and batteries, so that we figured out a way to store batteries in the next day or two, but how do we store it for a week? And that would make a big difference to really be able to have the vast majority of our energy sources, but probably not exclusively from energy. And funding is really critical. The World Bank and other countries are really developing. There's now a new report coming out from many countries called the Country Climate Development Report, which precisely tries to map out a vision for each country in terms of the trade-offs and the choices they need to make in terms of going away from very carbon-intensive industries, thinking about transportation systems, urban development. So the agenda is huge, and I think that's really the future where a lot of people want to go for innovation and new ideas, and I think that's where a lot of jobs are going to be available in the future.
Karen, China has had enormous success in lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. How has that success contributed towards a more sustainable future for the country?
I think it's also important moment we bring back the topic on the poverty issue. So look at what China has managed to make 800 million people out of poverty. That is massive achievement. And then the lesson can be copied and then to be learned by other countries that are facing the similar issues. Poverty issue related to the population. I think this is also something usually we get ignored about the populations affecting all the sectors, not just the climate, but the other SDG goals. So the population issues, the urbanization issues related to population and poverty can significantly make impacts on the way we live and the resource we need.
Yixing Xu, let's talk about population. We just heard that the world's population has now reached 8 billion. It continues to grow. But at the same time, our very finite resources are being threatened by climate change as well as the loss of biodiversity. What do you think will be the long-term impact, and how might we mitigate that impact?
Yeah, that's a great question, and this is the challenge we are facing. So we can see that in the past 150 years, developed country actually contributed the most to CO2 emissions, which means a lot of damage from climate change is contributed to that. So I think now the population is growing very fast. There are a lot of developing countries, a lot of low-income and mid-income countries. The people there are trying to improve their life standard. And I think it is unrealistic and also unfair for those countries to forego a better or more comfortable life simply because there are already a lot of CO2 emissions contributed by developed countries. So I think the challenge is here. We have to make everyone life much better compared to the past. But at the same time, we are facing damages from climate change. We are facing limited resources. So we have to find a way to solve it. And I would say the most important approach to solve this challenge is through technology innovations. It can help us solve all the previous problems. It can help us solve future problems too. So I think engineers, scientists definitely play a very important role in inventing new technologies to help us mitigate the damage from climate change. It also provides us solutions to change how we produce things. We have to invent all those technologies we don't have now. So right now, what we have is wind, solar, hydro, and some nuclears. That is great, and we need to scale up the mature technologies very, very fast. At the same time, we need to develop new technologies which are not already yet here. That means how to build long-duration energy storages, right? How can we store abundant of renewable energy from one season and use it in another season? And whether we can truly build a nuclear fusion, which can solve majority of the energy problem in the future. I think these technologies, we are in the process of developing them, but those are not mature yet. So I think technology innovation is definitely very critical in this process to help us solve the problems. Apparently, in the next few decades, some countries will be hit hard by climate change, by global warming. And we need to develop technologies, not just wind and solar, but also technologies to help people adapt to warmer climate. That means maybe in agriculture, we need to probably invent new crops or somehow modify the gene of the crops so that we make sure that the agricultural production is there to support the population growth. We need to reinforce ports, so we make sure that the commons on marine can still going. Simply because with warmer climate, we may face more damages from the extreme weather events, and we need to be prepared for that. So I would say the most important thing is really about how do we have the public money, public funding to support research and development? How do we have better policies to promote a large-scale scaling up of the existing technologies? And how can we build a market for people to adapt those technologies?
Ronnie Hamad, one of the questions that scientists, researchers, experts are often asked is whether we have enough time to combat the effects of climate change. And you know, you'll hear answers with people falling into two broad groups. One group that says, no, we are past the tipping point, it's too late. Others are saying, no, we still have time to combat the effects of climate change. There's been talk about adjusting that 1.5 degree target. What are your thoughts?
I mean, look, we are behind, that's clear, and there has to be more action. But I don't give up, because I do think that we have the resources, we have the innovation, the creativity, the ability to collaborate, and we've seen huge success stories. I mean, you know, when I look at China, for example, I see, you know, I was just looking at the report on China. You know, 1/3 of all wind energy is in China. 1/4 of all solar energy is in China. Even though today they are emitting a lot of greenhouse gases, they're not historically responsible for the impact of climate change, but they have the ability to transition to this country, and a lot of countries can benefit from the experience of countries like China, from the technology perspective, from the transition perspective, from, you know, the poverty reduction, extraordinary poverty reduction that we've seen over the years. So I'm still hopeful, but it's going to take a huge lift.
Karen, for you, what does the future of sustainability look like?
The future of sustainability, like one thing is definitely the solution, and also the support that should coming from a lot from the youth and then the young generation, who are not responsible for the problem being created, but being the main power And then the second thing is, I think we're gonna learn to adapt with extreme weather, adapt to horrible things happening as with global warming nowadays, which is irreversible. We really find the effective mitigation and also adaptation solution from technology development. But I think this is also creating lots of opportunities. So I'm optimistic. Yeah.
Okay, and on that optimistic note, we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. Delegates to the COP15 meeting are going home with an agreement. The Kunming-Montreal framework outlines a 30-30 plan to halt and reverse nature loss. That means putting 30% of the planet and 30% of degraded ecosystems under protection by the year 2030. Here's what some COP15 delegates we spoke with had to say.
Yeah, I think this is a big milestone for the next several years for the global biodiversity conservation, and also this is also express the China's ambition, big ambitions, and also put the ambition to practical actions.
They've covered lots of the areas that we wanted to see covered. We've got lots of like 30 by 30, as in protecting 30% of areas by 2030. They're in there, so that's good. But then a lot of it is up for interpretation.
Funding is a challenge for everyone. But we think we are in the path to really fill the gap that we have for financing of biodiversity.
These targets are supposed to basically last until 2030. That's 7 years of targets that are going to be really hard to reach. But there's a lot of commitments to get there.
In the next 10 or 20 years, our scientists can work together and to conserve this planet's biodiversity. And also as a member of a Chinese delegation, I'm very glad that as a developing country, also as a chairman country, China can play a very important role for conservation.
So what does the COP15 agreement mean for the planet's biodiversity and the efforts to fight climate change? We turn now to our panel. Mohammed Mahmoud is Director of the Climate and Water Program at the Middle East Institute. He joins us from Phoenix, Arizona. Carlos Joly is Emeritus Professor at the University of Campinas and a member of the Brazilian Academy of Sciences. He joins us from Campinas in Brazil. And joining us from Beijing, Changhua Wu is the CEO of the Beijing Future Innovation Center and Executive Director at the Professional Association for China's Environment. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Changhua Wu, let me start with you. So, as I just said, COP15 is over. There was broad agreement. We have the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. All countries signed off on this. There were some reservations by some countries, but in the end, all of them signed off on it. And we have the agreement on the major goals, which was the 30-30 plan, as well as mobilization of at least $200 billion for biodiversity protection. What is your assessment of this conference?
There are a few key words actually to describe the outcome of the COP15 in Montreal. One is ambitious, and the second one actually is historic, and also people using landmark. Those are the three words I've seen again and again repeated by many throughout the feedbacks as well as media report there as well. China presidency has definitely delivered a major milestones or breakthroughs actually for a successful outcome. Now we have the most ambitious ever goal in terms of protecting nature, and 30 by 30 was fully adopted at the end of the negotiation. The second breakthrough actually is the rights of the indigenous people and the local community, as well as the knowledge of indigenous people in terms of safeguarding the biodiversity there. And finance, definitely not adequate enough, but somehow we managed to agree that we're going to really commit fully into investing in nature, not only halting the loss of nature, but also trying to restore and bring back, reverse the trend, so that by 2030, we'll be able to be in a much better position, a little bit more comfortable position in terms of our relationship with nature, and hopefully somehow by continuing the efforts, we'll be able to really achieve the harmony, find the harmony, and achieve the harmony with the nature by mid of century. So in a nutshell, I think China presidency definitely has delivered a major outcome and hopefully somehow we'll be able to work together to deliver. So now it's time to implement and deliver the goals we said we're going to do.
Right. Mohammed Mahmood, what is your view on the outcome of this conference? I mean, as Chang Wei just told us a moment ago, yes, the goals are ambitious, but in the end, all the countries signed off on it. There was unanimous agreement. I mean, there were some reservations that came from some African countries, notably the Democratic Republic of Congo, Cameroon as well, expressed its reservations. These were mainly concerns over finance. But in the end, what did you make of it?
You know, I think that some of this is actually potentially hangover from the last two climate COPs. When we think of what happened with Glasgow, the Glasgow Pact occurring at the very last moment of the conference and having criticism that it didn't do enough. And then even this just recent COP27 that I was in Egypt that I was able to attend, culminating with the successful landmark agreement on loss and damage for developing nations. I think part of the criticism that came from those African countries essentially was related to funding, and to a certain extent it's a fair criticism. I think the letdown of Glasgow put pressure for later climate conferences to actually deliver huge agreements, huge landmark successes in terms of cooperation frameworks moving forward. The loss and damage one in COP27 was a huge one. And so looking at what happened at COP15 in terms of biodiversity, it can also be viewed the same way. But sometimes, because the focus is on making sure that we deliver such a huge deal and to ensure that the conference was successful in that regard, some of the nuances don't get filled out. And partly that's just because of timing and how much it takes to actually get an agreement done, that the criticism, okay, well, how are we going to do these objectives and goals that is set out in the 30 by 30 agreement, for example, or 30 by 30 deal, in terms of funding. And certainly for developing nations that don't necessarily have access to a lot of funding mechanisms to achieve their objectives, in this case, in terms of achieving the biodiversity goals, or even the other climate COP in terms of achieving funding for adaptation mitigation. So yes, the devil is certainly always in the details, but it's a landmark deal. It's a huge step forward. But now the work has to begin in terms of implementation, in terms of securing full funding, and in terms of actually looking towards projects that get these goals done.
Carlos Joly, of course, the devil is in the details. But if we look at one of the big challenges right now, that is implementation of the agreements that were signed in Montreal. How difficult is that going to be, especially at this time when we look at the global economic climate?
Yeah, this is our major concern. The economy, the global economy is not going through a very good phase. We are having a lot of problems with war and with the shortages of some of the commodities, and the prices are very high. But I think that the deal that was arranged in Montreal is really a landmark. We heard before the promises of funding that never realized, but I think this time is different. It's different because people are really aware of the stage that we are in terms of degradation, and they are looking not only on conservation, as Chang said in her first statement, they are always looking also to recovery, to restoration. And restoration is restoration of forest, for example, is a win-win situation. It's a situation that is very good for biodiversity because it will reconnect fragments, it will allow better conservation of most of the species, but it's also very important for climate change, because if you were restoring forests, permanent forests, these forests, while growing, they were removing CO2 from the atmosphere. So they also have a role to play in terms of the climate change agreements. So I think that with these situations where you can have a good solution for climate and a good solution for biodiversity, these are the ones that I think that will be ready to receive support and funds to be developed. And I think we have the knowledge on how to develop this restoration, or how to develop, for instance, in case of mangrove, the conservation of mangrove, because they are very important also in terms of CO2, the amount of CO2 they retain. So I think that the next year, 2023, we are going to be looking for these situations where you have very good results both for biodiversity and climate.
Changwa Wu, how will the biodiversity framework that was agreed to in Montreal impact efforts to combat climate change? Make the connection for us.
Sure. As Carlos has just started to articulate it, actually, planetary, the Earth is a system, right? And it's a life support system for all lives, actually, on Earth, and human beings are just a part of it. So on one side, we all know how nature works. It definitely has the magic in terms of regulating the water flows, the air flows, you name it. In the meantime, and so when you know, it's adjusted the temperature when it's too hot, actually, and the water system, the wetland, you name it, actually, the forest will help tremendously to cool us down. And that's a very critical part of the magic of nature. So throughout the Montreal Protocol, we started to see, actually, not only just addressing biodiversity in terms of, you know, protect and also restore the ecosystems there. In the meantime, we see clearly the connection or linkage, actually, with the climate solutions there. And that's a very exciting sort of trend that globally we understand much, much better now how nature and within the nature, how the climate system works and how climate change or temperature rises, changes, interact actually with nature, with ecosystems there. That's a major progress forward, and that's where we stand today.
Mohammed Mahmoud, of course, the big challenge for developing countries is how to strike that balance between protecting biodiversity and at the same time not sacrificing their economies. This is what the president of Bolivia, Luis Arce, had to say. Let's listen.
Hi, I am Luis Alberto Arce Catacora, president of the plurinational state of Bolivia. For Bolivia, sustainability means development, growth, but with all complete respect to the Mother Earth. That's what it means for us.
So, Mohammed, how difficult will it be for developing countries to strike that balance?
It's very difficult because we are in a stage of the world where countries are facing severe economic hardship and struggle, just the current state of inflation and connected impacts with the energy crisis and so forth. But at the same time, we are, as we heard earlier, at a potential tipping point in terms of protection for the planet and the climate crisis, and how we're able to address that by doing actual impactful actions like coming out of the COP15 biodiversity, the loss and damage from COP27. So I worry that we will reach a point where a sacrifice more on one side versus the other will have to be made. But the way things are going, that choice may have to be made, where economies may have to suffer further as we look towards approaching a more dangerous tipping point for the planet in terms of recovery from climate change impacts, both in all aspects of natural resources.
Carlos, Jody, something that often gets lost in the mix is articulating the economic benefits of protecting biodiversity. Let's listen to what the Executive Secretary of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, Elizabeth Maruma Mrema, had to say. Let's listen.
Over 1 million species are feared going to extinction just within this century. And the species is both animals, plants, insects. If you look at land degradation, over 75% of the land is already degraded. 66% of the marine environment is degraded. 85% of the wetland is also degraded. So basically, entire biodiversity ecosystem is not in good shape. And yet, economists, the World Economic Forum, for instance, tells us that 50% of the global GDP comes from nature and the ecosystems it provides.
So, Carlos, what do you make of what we heard then? Should more efforts be put into articulating these economic benefits that would come from protecting biodiversity?
Yeah, she's absolutely right. I mean, the economy, we can have different models to developed countries. If you take Brazil, for instance, we are in a very privileged situation because we can preserve what's been left, not only preserve, but restore part of the Amazon forest and part of the Atlantic forest without losing our capacity to produce food. What we need to do is to use those degraded lands and recover those degraded lands with restoration and use the good land and improve productivity. So in the end, it's perfectly possible to keep the economy of the country going at the same time that you increase your protections to nature.
Right.
And nature gives back a lot of ecosystem services that are essential for our living.
Changwa, we've only got a minute left. Let's talk about China. China has already made significant efforts to protect biodiversity. How will COP15 impact those efforts?
The impact will be huge, and I think it signals another milestone to be coming up. China has embodied actually the spirit, the essence of the new framework in terms of now we recognize the crisis and we need to shrink our ecological footprints. That's why 30 by 30 is so critical. In the meantime, we have to make sure we do compensation. And because we have developing countries within the country, so transfer of payments actually has been a major part of the solution within the country. And in the meantime, of course, we need to continue to invest in R&D, scientific research, and also solutions to make sure this is economy. This is not a separate thing. Protect nature and biodiversity is how we're going to farm, how we're going to fish, how we're going to mine resources there. At the end of the day, it is about a new model or new mode of economy growth coming forward.
And Changwa, a very quick answer on this. One word if you can. I mean, we've been told by the experts that up to 1 million species of plants and animals are threatened if we don't do something, and they could disappear within the next few decades. Is there still time to fix this?
Absolutely. It's never too late, even though it's very depressing.
Right.
I think that's where the scientific technology coming into the picture, as well as global collaboration.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. Now, over the last 6 days, we have looked at various aspects of sustainability, from building a greener economy to cutting-edge technology and China's role in creating a more sustainable world. This is our call to action.
We are reeling from multiple crises: climate change, conflict, COVID, and economic pain. In that time, hundreds of millions of people have slipped back into poverty and hunger. The writing is on the wall. Time is running out for us to ensure a livable, sustainable planet. Media organizations have a critical role to play. In that regard, CGTN has highlighted several aspects of sustainable development. The challenges that lie ahead. China's commitment to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Collective and individual responsibility. Role of entrepreneurs and corporations. Contributions by the youngest generation. Solutions going forward. We should collaborate on media events to encourage global public discourse and produce compelling programming to highlight the challenges we face. As individuals, we must also do our bit by planting trees to negate the impact of deforestation. We also should recycle as much as possible to prevent our oceans and ecosystems from choking in plastic. Young people are the most at peril, and they have to make their voices heard.
Individually, everyone has a role to play to save our dear planet.
Corporations can play a crucial role by listening to consumers. Investing in green technology and promoting sustainably produced products are the key to a viable future. We invite our partners to join us in a worldwide alliance to push for a sustainable development initiative that would include increasing coverage of major issues such as food insecurity, education, women's rights, and climate change to raise global awareness. Giving a platform to youth activists, entrepreneurs, and innovators to build momentum for solutions. Working in tandem with academic institutions, multinational companies, governments, and nonprofit organizations to implement the goals of sustainable development, demanding accountability from entities that are not holding up their part of the bargain, executing a unified strategy across all media platforms to report facts without fear or favor.
And that does it for our Global Action Initiative 2022 coverage focused on sustainability. Up next, our documentary, Sustainable in Africa.